Ladies and gentlemen, I give you a toast. Ladies and gentlemen, may this fair land we love so well in dignity and freedom dwell. Though worlds may change and go awry, while there is still one voice to cry, there'll always be an England while there's a country lane. Wherever there's a cottage small beside a field of grain, there'll always be an England while there's a busy street. Wherever there's a turning wheel, a million marching feet. Red, white and blue, what does it mean to you? Surely you're proud, shout it aloud, Britain's awake. The Empire too, we can depend on you. Freedom remains, these are the chains nothing can break. There'll always be an England, and England shall be free. If England means as much to you as England means to me.
Red, white and blue, what does it mean to you? Surely you're proud, shout it aloud, Britain's away. The Empire too, we can depend on you. Freedom remains, these are the chains nothing can break. There'll always be an England, and England shall be free. If England means as much to you as England means to me.
Right, greetings everybody. Today I'm very fortunate to get Colonel MacGregor on the channel again for the third time, and I think a lot of my subscribers know he's just the ticket for listening to what's really going on, so I'm looking forward to this half an hour or so to picking his brain and see where all these things are going. So welcome, Colonel. Welcome again. Very, very much so.
Happy to be here.
I was minded this morning of a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Not my favorite man, I have to say, but on this one he got it right when it looked like the Great Britain was going to come into the war on the Confederate side. I think he very wisely then said, "One war at a time." It was his it was his quote, and I put that to you to get the ball rolling, Colonel. One war at a time. And it seems to me, as these are really United States wars in the main, egged on by the little guy, Great Britain, like a sort of yappy terrier, I would say one war at a time, if indeed you need any wars at all. So we've got Ukraine, and of course we've got the Middle East. So things are not looking good. Perhaps you'd like to kick off with your view of where we are in the Ukraine. You might just cover, because of the ignorance we have in England on this subject, very quickly on how it started. How did we get there? How did we get to this ridiculous situation?
Well, that could take hours. I think it's important to understand a couple of things, because your question presupposes, using Lincoln's observation, that there is some sort of strategy in Washington. And I keep trying to explain to people there is no strategy. Strategy, to exist at all, presupposes that there are limitations to resources. There are limits to interests. In other words, that someone sits down with a group of other people in a place like Washington, D.C., and says, we were voted into office to represent the interests of the American people. what are the interests of the American people? Well, do we have an interest in eastern Ukraine? A strategic interest? Have we ever had a strategic interest in eastern Ukraine? The answer is firmly no. So why would we involve ourselves in a war in eastern Ukraine? If you look at the Middle East, the next question is, do we have an interest in the Middle East? Well, yes, we have several interests that are tied and have been tied for decades to the oil and natural gas in the region. We also have this state, which is a legacy of the British Empire, called Israel, that was founded after World War II. And we have devoted ourselves to its sustainment and defense. Okay. Are we going to continue to do that? We did that during the Cold War because we saw Israel as a potential base of support for the projection of power and influence at the time that would compete with Soviet influence in the region. Well, that evaporated. Well, we continue to be devoted to Israel because we like it and we see it as a fellow traveler on this great road, as at least in theory, a liberal democracy and all that goes with it. Do we have an interest beyond helping Israel to defend itself? The answer to that is probably no, since we still have other interests in the region that are equally important to us. Now, when I say those things, no one is raising these things. There is no such discussion. There is no coherent strategy that says, what do we want? What's the purpose? How do we achieve the purpose? And what do we want the place to look like when we're finished? Now, we have two problems. Our friend Zelensky is just a puppet. He literally does what we tell him to do. And when people say, oh, he's exceeded his brief, he's now striking targets deep inside Russia, and everyone in Washington pretends that, oh, that's terrible, he should not be doing that. In truth, the CIA and your MI6 are running the show there, and he's supposed to do whatever he can to keep this war going through the election and try to create the illusion that there's something left in Ukraine. In other words, that there is a legitimate Ukrainian state that he runs, an effective military establishment, and it should continue to be supported. That's the whole mission right now. Just keep it going. When you go to the Middle East, it's very different because it is Mr. Netanyahu who is in charge, not us. And right now, it doesn't make any difference who is elected in November, assuming we have this election and it's meaningful, which many of us question because of the fraudulent voting that's so widespread. Whoever is elected has promised to continue the war on, that Mr. Netanyahu has unleashed and is leading. Now, why is this? Well, we were certainly sympathetic to the Israelis after the 7 October attacks. All of us were. Everyone who looked at that thought that was reprehensible and awful. And we said, Israel has the right to strike back. And of course, the Israeli theory is that if you kill 100 of us in order to restore, quote unquote, their notions of deterrence, well, they have to kill several thousand people and destroy 10 times the number of buildings in order to restore their notion of deterrence. So we thought that something would be spectacular, but no one ever believed for a second that we would end up in the situation where we are. We didn't understand that they dusted a plan off that was on the shelf for many, many decades to thoroughly complete the conquest of Palestine, remove all of the Arabs, whether they're Christians or Muslims, irrelevant, and ultimately then to clean up the problem in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. And that's where they are now. And they are triggering a much larger war, which will inevitably bring them into conflict with Iran. And our views of Iran have always been conflicted, to be blunt. We have bought the Israeli line that all things evil and bad in the world are a product of Iran on one level. But on another level, we want to do business with the Iranians. That's a very powerful and large state in the region. I don't know how many people live there now, but it's probably close to 100 million, maybe 90 million. It's a civilization unto itself, Persia. We have no interest in destroying it. And we understand that if we do destroy it, we'll create a vacuum. Others will fill that vacuum. And that could be people that we don't necessarily like. So our view of Iran on the secondary level is we don't want to go to war with them. But right now, our government is completely in the grip of the Israel lobby. So much pro-Israeli money has been assembled that it currently controls both parties as far as foreign and defense policy goes. And so there is no alternative course. There is no ulterior, what's the right word, approach to foreign policy or defense policy in the region. So we are essentially in a position of being a vassal state of Greater Israel. It's very different from Ukraine, where at least there we do have a say in what happens and we can pull out anytime we like. That doesn't exist in the Middle East. We are entirely dependent upon direction from Mr. Netanyahu. That's a bad position to be in.
It seems, I always draw these analogies, it does seem to me that we have echoes of 1914 here, where a very bellicose Austria-Hungary empire, bellicose against Serbia, then drew everybody in. It drew in the Russian Empire, and it drew in the German Empire because they felt they had a responsibility. Then that drew in the French, who had a relationship with, a treaty with Russia. And it drew us under something called, as you know, the Entente Cordiale, which was not a treaty. We were in no way obliged to go to war in 1914. We in no way. There was no moral or treaty obligation to do so. But we did, to the detriment of the British Empire, 3 million deaths and so on and so on. We all know about what a tragedy the Great War was. And of course, it came again in 1939, just part two. It was just part two of the Great War. Now, as a military historian myself, and indeed as you are, you must see the similarities of getting dragged in. You get dragged in, a big power who is sponsoring a small power gets dragged in because Israel think they've got a big mate, and they have. Ukraine think they've got a big mate, and they have. But then, of course, other people have a big mate. You know, it could be the Russian Federation, it could be Iran, which is a lot stronger than it used to be. I sometimes wonder, and it's difficult because I'm not having a pop at the America because we're just as bad here. But you are now the great power. United States is the great power. And it seems to me when I look at sometimes clips on the TV and I look at people like Lindsey Graham and John Bolton and some of these other characters, I have to say, indeed, our own prime minister now, who wanted deep strikes into the Russian Federation, which even the Pentagon thought was mad, some of these characters in Washington, I wonder, and some of my colleagues over here wonder, if they are actually mentally unwell.
Well, I think you can make a good case for that. I think it's probably less complex than mental derangement. You simply have a group of people who have not come to terms with reality in the world where they live. For most people in Washington, it's still 1991. They have this picture of the United States as having come out of the Cold War, unchallenged, unbroken, unbended, whatever you want to call it, with armed forces and money and power that no one else can match. It's rather similar to the view the British took of themselves in the run-up to World War I. You know, we've got the men, we've got the money, we've got the ships and all this sort of business. We also suffer from an acute case of national narcissism. And we have lots of people at the top who are very arrogant. And of course, as we like to point out, Bolton, Graham, and others are always ready to fight a war that other people are compelled to fight, and they are not. None of them are interested or were ever interested in being in harm's way. So it's others who end up paying the price. I think your analogy is right in some respects. It merits attention because Israel is quite capable of sparking a much larger regional and global conflict in ways that Ukraine has not been able to do. And it's not to say that the neocons in Washington haven't tried to do that with Ukraine. But I think the Europeans realize behind closed doors that they don't have the resources, they don't have the militaries, the manpower to do very much. And I think that most of them are now very afraid of being booted out of office and would like to find a way out of the Ukraine war morass. In the Middle East, it's a little different in the United States because like the British during the height of empire, Most Americans on most days pay almost no attention to what happens beyond the borders of their country. As far as they are concerned, war is something that happens on someone else's soil. They don't expect it to visit them here in the United States. Even though technology has changed, we have these open borders, millions of people have poured in. We have at least 53, 54 million people inside the United States who were not born here. That tells you something about the lack of societal cohesion that we currently confront. The point is that we are not strong. We are not the nation of 1991, not by a long shot, but we don't seem to understand that. Now, you mentioned the Pentagon. The people at the top of the Department of Defense, particularly the senior officers, are sensitive to the limitations on resources and manpower. We can barely recruit for our armed forces for a whole range of reasons, not the least of which is this emphasis on diversity and inclusion and equity and all that nonsense. No, you just can't get the red-blooded young American male who used to want to prove himself to join the military because you're telling him that someone who is a little girl that weighs barely 100 pounds can do anything he can do, or that someone who decides to be transgender or whatever else they define themselves to be has every right to run around in high heels and uniform and so forth. And so the average red-blooded American male says, what do I want with this? I don't want to be part of this. I'm going to find something else to do. So we've got a lot of problems with recruiting. When you add that to the fact that we are living on the legacy of decades of research and development during the Cold War. So most of our technology, most of our weapon systems, certainly our organization structure is all anachronistic. It's not prepared for a different kind of warfare now in a different world. You put all of this together, and then you have the people that are in charge who have received incredible amounts of money over the years from the Israel lobby. You can end up in one of two positions with the Israel lobby, and they're not unique in this. When you start dealing with people that are in the pharmaceutical business or in the defense industries, the view is you are either with us or against us. If you're with us, we can ensure that all of these funds go into your reelection campaign and guarantee you holding this seat in perpetuity. On the other hand, if you don't vote the subsidies for us, if you don't vote the outlays for us, then we can give all of this money that you would normally get to your opponent, and we'll remove you from office. Well, most people on most days have chosen to take the money. And so when you saw Mr. Netanyahu come to the United States and speak to Congress, he had, 5 standing ovations? There were only, I think, a total of 12 members that declined to show up to listen to him. Only one Republican, and I think the rest of those were Democrats. It's a very strange situation right now, and most Americans aren't paying attention. They still aren't, because we're focused at home. Americans are focused on the hurricanes. They're focused on the illicit immigration. They're focused on the dramatic rise in criminality that has come with these open borders. Their focus is here. They want things done here now, but they have no influence in Washington because the money is elsewhere, and the people that are governing want the money. And they'll tell you point blank, when it comes to winning elections, donors are more important than voters. And so that's why we refer to Washington, D.C. as donor-occupied territory. Our policies, if there is a strategy, and I don't think there is any, it's certainly being shaped by billionaires who have the money and the influence to buy up policymakers. In other words, to buy politicians. And even though they'll say, well, I'm not for sale, they all are. We've always had this problem. If you want to speak to Senator so-and-so for 5 minutes, it'll be $10,000 in his reelection campaign account. If you want to talk to him for 10 minutes, well, then that's $10,000. I mean, it's even during the campaign. So you want private time with President Trump, that'll cost you this much money that has to go into his election campaign. Same thing with Harris. It's a big business. And that's why people show up in Washington of modest means, and then they come out as multimillionaires. It's a money machine. So our republic internally doesn't work anymore. We have to accept that fact. And I think a lot of Americans have figured it out. Not all, I'd say a good third have figured out this republic doesn't work for us. supposed to be representative government. And all this business about save our democracy, that's all crap. I mean, the people saying those things, their notions of democracy have more in common with Lenin's notion of democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, finding a way to keep themselves permanently in power. So you put it all together, and you have this terrible situation in which we have more than half of the United States Navy sitting in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, because it takes almost more than half of the Navy to keep those carrier battle groups and ships properly manned, sustained, and so forth. You have 1,000 fighter jets spread out all over the place, ready to pounce, plus bombers in places like Diego Garcia inside the United States, the Balkans, maybe in Great Britain. They're all waiting for Mr. Netanyahu to attack Iran. When that occurs, the expectation is Iran will strike back. And of course, at that point, the argument will be, well, Iran has no right to attack Israel, and therefore it must be destroyed. It's sort of like Ukraine. It was an unprovoked attack by Mr. Putin. No, it wasn't. They were goaded into that for years. People in Washington were cheering when he finally went in because they thought this is our big opportunity to destroy Russia and strip it of its resources and put in a new government and so forth and so on. You see the same thing happening now with Iran. Well, if we can do enough damage, the government falls apart, we can take it over. We'll install our puppets. It's bad business. So the analogy with World War I is correct. And in addition, I would go a step further and say, now you have Russia and China. And China is now firmly in the camp with Russia because China's view is, if I don't help Russia, Russia could fall. If Russia falls, I'm next. I mean, this is the mentality. So the Russians are firmly supporting the Iranians, not just because the Iranians were faithful allies during the Ukraine war, but their view is this is the bid by the United States and its European allies for permanent military, political, and economic hegemony. And that's why you have BRICS. BRICS is the new alternative to the US, or I would say Washington, New York City, London dominated global financial system. People want to get out from under it. They want to dump the dollar. They want to do business in other currency. They want something that's backed by gold, silver, and potentially other commodities. And so there are 84 countries that want to join BRICS. Well, that's most of the world's existing nation states. When you add that to the BRICS that are already there, where does that leave the rest of us? 25 or 30 countries. I think we're afraid at this point. There are people in Washington who are very afraid that if they do not win, quote unquote, in Ukraine, and that's not going to happen, they're not going to win there, and then they go forward to lose in the Middle East in a confrontation that begins with Iran, but then becomes an Iranian-Russian affair and threatens to bring in the Turks as well, and then China standing behind them, that we could lose this confrontation, in which case this last bid for hegemony falls completely. So it's a very dangerous situation. And I don't worry about Russia or anyone else using nuclear weapons. I worry about us as we are making our ignominious withdrawal and in denial of reality, turn to a nuclear weapon as some means of salvaging our position. I hope that doesn't happen. I also fear that that sort of thing could ultimately happen to Israel, because as I look at Israel now, as I've described this growing constellation of opposing nations, I think Israel is in the position that George Armstrong Custer was in June of 1876 when he rode out to find the Indians on the Little Bighorn, and he found them. Only instead of finding a few Indians that he thought he had to pin down and defeat, he found 10,000 waiting for him, and he was annihilated. And I think that's what Israel is on that kind of road right now, where the opponents of them and of us are multiplying with each passing day, and the solidarity of this constellation against them is growing firmer with each passing day. So I'm worried that Israel will cease to exist. It'll be under such tremendous military pressure that it cannot survive, which was the warning I gave when this whole thing started, really not on 7 October, but before Christmas, when it became clear that this was going to be the opportunity that Netanyahu and his friends saw to settle all accounts with all opponents. very dangerous position to take, and I think they're in a lot of trouble.
I think one of the problems that we've got too, I mean, is the lack of what you and I would probably argue is a free press. I mean, we saw the suppression of a free press in 1812, the Anglo-American War. We saw it again in 1860-61, where editors were incarcerated, habeas corpus was lifted. There seems to be no, and incidentally, this is just the same here. You know, this is just the same as in Britain. There is no educated or informed opinion contrary. In fact, we are not allowed here to listen to Russia Today. We're not allowed to listen to any of Putin's speeches or the other side of the coin. Very, very odd situation as a free-born Englishman not to be able to tune in to another major nation's radio in case it might corrupt me. You know, this is all so new for us. I'm 75. This is just really new in the last sort of 20 years, where any form of pushback against all this is simply verboten. You simply can't do it. You're closed down. It might be interesting. I don't know whether you've heard this or not, but this morning, Sky TV News is closing down because nobody's watching it. Nobody watches BBC. Yeah, BBC News, nobody's watching it on their news programs because although the British aren't getting an alternative view, they're certainly not buying the state view. So generally speaking, apart from channels like, you know, myself and colleagues over here and yours with the, you know, with the judge and so on and so on, this is the only avenue to actually find out what's going on and to take a broad view of what the situation is and what the dangers are. In the 1960s, when I was a lad with hair and stuff like that, we were all, it didn't matter how different we were. I wasn't to ban the bomber. I didn't march up and down because I didn't think that was going to be the right answer with an evil empire like the Soviet Empire, which it was in those days, which armed with nuclear weapons. But there was one thing that held us all together. We had one dynamic that held us all together. Whether you were a hairy sort of student walking around with a banner, or whether you were a young soldier, or whatever it was, or a politician, we all knew that a world war, was a really, really bad thing for everyone. And as I see it now, and I see the comment, and I see newspapers, even what used to be quality newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, which has been hijacked completely and totally now by the war lobby, and in the name of now that Boris Johnson is the editor-in-chief, which I find extraordinary. The man who actually stopped the peace treaty in May 2022. This man runs is the editor of the biggest, most prestigious national newspaper in Britain, possibly Europe. This man, how did he get there? How do these people get there, Colonel? They're all nutters.
Well, look, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Boris Johnson is sort of the principal buffoon in the circus, and it's depressing. I have a friend who's a biblical scholar, and he said to me the other day, the beginning of wisdom is mistrust of the government and the media. You've heard the quote in the Bible, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, he's turned that around. I think he's right.
I think he's right.
And I'm glad to know that people in England and Scotland and Wales, I hope, are beginning to see the reality that it's this sort of press offensive is universal. There's one narrative spun out by MI6 and CIA. It's disseminated to all the outlets, and everyone is supposed to nod. And if you don't and say don't agree with it, then you're anything, a bigot, an anti-Semite, a racist. All the expletives and nasty things that you can think of are hurled at you. This has been building for a long time. I think it started when news in the United States, I would argue, became entertainment. You know, we no longer had these dry, old white men who came on and delivered facts. You know, this is what happened today. And we started seeing lovely young women reading teleprompters and revealing skirts, and everyone instantly was distracted and thought, oh, this is great. And this is kind of where we've been going for some time, and now the message is complete nonsense, and we're asked to believe it. I think this is part of the larger globalist effort, but I think people need to understand something. Our elites Your elites are actually very weak, and they are very much afraid of where things are headed for the reasons that you just cited. People are waking up. They're figuring it out. They understand this is a lot of nonsense. I always loved this line in a movie from this famous movie, Zulu, where this particular British soldier's name is Hook. And he says, what am I doing here? He said, I don't know a Zulu. I've never seen one. And why would I want to shoot a Zulu? And why would the Zulu want to kill me? And then the sergeant says, you're going to do the job you were paid to do, and you're here. And so that's the end of it. Well, that's true for those of us who are soldiers. There's no question about it. But his point was valid. And I think that's what's sinking in here. And, the problem we have is similar to the one that you had at the time in the British Empire. When the Zulus overran 1,100 British soldiers and killed them, Prime Minister Disraeli lost his position as prime minister. It was a no confidence vote. And he walked around saying, who are these people? How did this happen? And people in Britain were just, they were offended and they were horrified. 1,100 men killed. In other words, if you had a few here or there, you could lose 1,100 men over 6 months and nobody cared. But if you lost 1,100 men in one day, well, that was horrific and had to be addressed. That's where we are. Everyone has known for a long time with the force that we maintain that if you get a few of us killed, that's fine. And you can ensure that stays off the television screens. But when you get a lot of people killed, you can't conceal it anymore, and that threatens your policy position. I think that there are a lot of people in the world that understand this, and I'm very worried about our forces right now in the Middle East and elsewhere, that someone will say, well, why don't we just go after this concentration of 2,000 or 3,000 Americans sitting in this forward operating base in Iraq or Syria or Jordan, and we'll just annihilate them. That'll get everybody's attention. Well, that will get people's attention. Look what happened in Beirut in 1983 when they bombed the hospital and the Marines lost over 300 men. Now, we'd lost other people, but we hadn't lost that many in one day. Suddenly, everyone was horrified. You may recall that. Ronald Reagan, as president, went out and welcomed back all of the coffins draped in flags carried by Marines off the thing. It was a sort of I don't know what you call it, catharsis that everybody in the country went through. And what was the decision at that point by Reagan? He got us out because he recognized there was no reason to be there. What are we doing in Lebanon? Why are we there? Why did we go there to begin with? And all the answers were unsatisfactory. So we got out. And I think that's where we're headed ultimately. We're going to be getting out of everywhere. It's just a matter of time.
The American forces in Syria are desperately exposed, aren't they, in Iraq? And again, as you rightly say, they couldn't be supplied. There is no way out. If they can't win, they must. They're in a pocket. They must die, and there's no way out for them. And of course, have we not just recently? Putin getting closer, I would argue, to Syria at the moment. He was out there quite recently, been speaking to Assad quite recently. So I think that's tightening that. If you the other side of the hill, of course, it's the other side of the hill, as you would understand and I understand as soldiers. It would be that what would they do? What is the worst thing they can do?
Right. Well, we have benefited, you and we, and people don't understand this, from the enormous restraint exercised by President Putin. President Putin is nothing if not cautious and deliberate. And contrary to all of the aspersions cast on him, on his character, he's someone who clearly, unambiguously opposes the outbreak of a major war. He's done everything in his power to prevent that. The reasons you have thousands of Russians on the ground in Iran, hastily assembling an air and missile defense structure, putting together command and control and helping with weapon systems is not because the Russians want a war, it's to prevent one. By establishing a position in Iran for the Iranians as well as for themselves that hopefully we, being sober-minded people, which is what I think Putin assumes. I think he's wrong, but that's what he assumes, will see this and say, aha, we don't really want a war. But unfortunately, these things don't make much difference to politicians in Washington. And obviously, I don't think they make much difference to your political elite either, because both groups in both London and Washington seem very excited about the prospect of going to war with Iran. As I understand it, your Prime Minister Starmer has offered British assets to join with ours and Israeli assets in this great assault on Iran. Incomprehensible to me, but so it is.
Absolutely, I did. In fact, I did on my channel just a while ago with a chap who won't know probably, Professor Dutton, who's over here, who's a psychologist, and we had quite a long chat on my video, him and me, about these people. I stick to my guns. I think they're mentally unwell. I think it's as simple as that. And to actually, you would give Putin no choice at all. If he did a long-range attack on a Russian city, he would then have no choice. The Kremlin would not let him remain on the touchline. He would then, and what would he do? What would he do if there was something like that? Well, we've got all the 2,000, 3,000 American soldiers in Syria, another 3,000 perhaps in a base in Iraq. There's such an easy target, and it's a military target. It's a military target, and of course we know that Iran have been paying very close attention indeed to make sure that they don't kill civilians. It's military, and these military targets are sitting there, and I think it would be a gift. But then there we are. We've run out of time, Colonel, now, which is a shame. I've only had some other things to say to you, but your time is precious, and I hope you'll be kind enough to favour me with a visit in a month or two again. And we can talk about perhaps the technical aspects of some of these things, and perhaps expand on the fact when we talk about getting involved in the Ukraine, boots on the ground, so and so forth, wherever it is, just the big difference between an army which is well equipped and has been in combat for 3 years, how much further ahead that is of a peacetime, broadly speaking, a peacetime army. And by gum, history shows us that in spades, doesn't it? And so.
Absolutely.
Even if we tried to do something, we haven't got the muscle. We haven't got and we don't now. This is the first time I think you and I would agree, it's the first time in our lives that we've seen the foeman, as it were, have a more sophisticated weapon systems. We're not used to that.
Remember Kitchener's comments after he was announced as the new effectively Minister of War. He was brought back from Egypt, where he was presiding as potentate or whatever down there in 1914. And I'm not a big Kitchener fan, frankly, but I thought this comment was brilliant. Kitchener, by the way, had actually been with the French army as an observer during the Franco-Prussian War. And that informed him about the Germans and the Prussians. He understood what they were dealing with. So after he accepted the position as Minister of War, some journalist, probably from the Times, came up and said, "Oh, Lord Kitchener, is this not a brave decision by the members of the cabinet to go to war?" And he said, "Oh, yes, it's very courageous. It's very brave. They've decided to make war on the greatest power with the greatest army in the world, when we effectively have none." Now, there was a British army. It was very small, and it didn't have to be very large because that really wasn't in Britain's interest, as you and I know, just as we've never had a very big army because it's not necessarily in our interest. We're primarily a maritime and an aerospace power. And ultimately, they had to build up armies from millions of civilians whose lives were then destroyed. But he understood what he was dealing with. You know, I remember Kitchener noted that Churchill was downcast and shocked when Kitchener told him that the war would not be won in the North Sea by the Royal Navy. You know, Churchill used to quip that, who was it, Jackie Fisher? I don't know who the First Lord of the Admiralty was at that point, that he was the only man in England who could lose the war in one day. Completely divorced from reality. The fleet was wonderful, but it was irrelevant to the outcome on the ground in France. And we have this kind of excursion into fantasy land. That's why we increasingly refer to Washington as Fantasy Island.
Point of fact, it was Jellicoe, and of course, yeah, you're absolutely right. The real threat came from submarines to the British to Britain, and it was dire by 1917. Now, here's a funny thing. We still didn't adopt the convoy system until late 1917, which we had learnt was effective from the Napoleonic Wars. And it makes you wonder how these comedians get into. I mean, Jellicoe was a charming and nice and noble man. There's no question about that. I've read several biographies of Jellicoe. But I mean, Convoy is Janet and John book one, isn't it? Really?
You've just raised a question that it deserves hours of study. You have a very famous colonel of engineers who wrote a book called The Psychology of Military Incompetence. And every once in a while, I'll pull it off the shelf and just refresh my memory, because he was so right in everything he said.
Yes, I know. And it's not the only book you can pull off. There's no shortage, I'm afraid, especially when the British are concerned.
Well, I had you'll find this entertaining. One of my classmates who became a 4-star, when we were both on active duty, this would have been about 2000 or 1999, I think, or it could have been a little earlier, could have been 1997. He said something to me that I'll never forget, because I had written this book called Breaking the Phalanx, which was wildly well received in many, many circles all over the United States, and actually by many of your British military leaders. And he said to me, Doug, I'm suspicious of Army officers that write books. How do they have time to do that if they're doing their jobs? And that's the mentality that we advanced to 4 stars. That's the way it is. It's been that way forever in the Anglosphere, I think.
I think it probably. They get cleared out. The first couple of years clears them out, of course, but sailing close to the wind all the time, aren't we? Sailing close to the wind. Well, Colonel, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on my humble channel. And I know everybody loves to see you when you do come on, because I've got a lot of ex-servicemen who follow me, who subscribe.
Well, God bless everybody in England. I wish you all the best. And remember, I think you should start every program from now on until hell freezes over with "There will always be an England." I can't imagine a world without it.
Well, that's so sweet of you to say so, and neither can I have to say. And I'll get my man on it. Again, thank you so much, and all the best to you. And I do hope you'll bear in mind that you've got a welcome in East Yorkshire if you ever do come over, and there's a nice little cottage waiting for you and your wife.
Well, thanks very much. I'll keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll escape at some future point.
Marvelous. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Toodaloo. As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I'll automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.